As a discarded brass casing hissed in the dirt, still hot enough to brand a crescent moon, Caleb came to the quiet realization that he was untouchable. Heroism had nothing to do with it. It was simply the cold, mathematical certainty of a predator. With the wind and the distance entirely under his control, everyone else was just making noise. The smell of the firing line was always the same: burnt carbon, hot copper, and the sharp, chemical tang of gun oil cooking off a barrel. For Caleb, it was the smell of validation. He lay prone on the concrete pad, his cheek welded to the adjustable stock of an Accuracy International AXSR. His eye, pressed perfectly to the optic, didn't blink. At 22, Caleb had the kind of raw, twitch fiber talent that made the instructors at the High Desert Tactical Institute both proud and deeply irritated. He was arrogant, but the worst part about his arrogance was that the math backed it up. Target 3, 900 yards. Wind is full value from 3 o'clock, 8 miles per hour. Instructor Baker droned, his voice flat through the electronic comms. Caleb didn't check his Kestrel wind meter. He'd already felt the breeze shift the tiny, sweat-soaked hairs on the back of his neck. He dialed 2.5 MOA into the elevation turret. Click, click, click. The sound was tactile, satisfying. He didn't adjust for windage on the dials. He held over in the reticle. It was faster, showier. He exhaled, letting all the air out of his lungs, sinking into the natural respiratory pause. The crosshairs floated over the painted white steel silhouette, a half-mile away. He applied 2 pounds of pressure to the trigger. The sear broke. The rifle bucked, a concussive slap that kicked up a cloud of fine, talcum-like dust from the mat. Caleb was already back on the scope before the sound of the gunshot even reached the target. He watched the vapor trail, a momentary disturbance in the air, arc gracefully downward. A heartbeat later, ping. A dark smudge appeared dead center on the steel plate. Impact, Baker said, bored. Next shooter. Caleb rolled off the gun, popping the magazine out and clearing the chamber with a sharp rack of the bolt. He sat up, wiping a smear of gritty dust and sweat from his forehead. He looked down the line of other students. They were fiddling with their ballistic calculators, wiping down their lenses, stressing over barometric pressure drops. Amateurs. They were playing a video game. Caleb was playing God. He uncapped his water bottle, the lukewarm water tasting faintly of plastic, and that was when he heard it. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was a maddening, arrhythmic sound. Caleb turned. 30 yards down the line, an old man was pushing a wide-bristled broom across the concrete, gathering the morning's spent brass casings into a glittering pile. Edmund. Nobody really knew the groundskeeper's last name. He was just part of the furniture at the institute. He looked to be pushing 70, though the deep tanned ravines in his face made it hard to tell. He wore faded denim work pants, a high-visibility orange vest over a stained thermal shirt, and boots that looked like they had survived a house fire. He smelled faintly of decaying pine needles, old motor oil, and stale chewing tobacco. Scrape, scrape. Caleb felt a spike of irrational annoyance. The old man moved with a pronounced limp, his right leg dragging slightly, throwing off the tempo of his sweeping. It bothered Caleb. Caleb lived in a world of precise metronomes, heartbeats, breath holds, bullet flight times. Edmund was walking entropy. Hey, watch the muzzle, Caleb snapped, though Edmund wasn't particularly close to Caleb's rifle. The old man stopped pushing the broom. He didn't look startled, just tired. He slowly turned his head, his neck popping audibly. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky right before it snows. They lacked the frantic, eager energy of the students. They were eyes that had seen too much and found most of it boring. "Ain't anywhere near your muzzle, kid," Edmund said. His voice sounded like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "Just keep the dust down," Caleb muttered, feeling a sudden, strange flush of embarrassment. He quickly masked with hostility. "You're kicking up debris. It gets in the glass." Edmund looked at Caleb's $10,000 rifle, then at Caleb's pristine tactical pants with the built-in knee pads. He didn't sneer. He didn't roll his eyes. He just spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into an empty coffee cup he had wedged into his cleaning cart. "Wind's doing more to your glass than my broom is," Edmund said quietly, turning back to his work. "Scrape, scrape." Caleb scowled, shoving his rifle into its padded drag bag. He hated the old man. Not because Edmund was rude, but because Edmund was completely unimpressed. To Edmund, Caleb wasn't an apex predator. He was just another kid making a mess that needed sweeping up. By Thursday afternoon, the high desert had turned violently ugly. The temperature had spiked to 98 degrees, baking the earth until it cracked. Worse, a storm front was stalling over the mountains to the west, pushing aggressive, schizophrenic thermal winds down into the canyon where the range sat. The air wasn't just moving, it was boiling. Through the spotting scopes, the mirage was so thick it looked like the target plates were submerged in running water. They warped, stretched, and danced. Baker had pushed them back to the 1,200-yard line. This was the final qualification stage. "Conditions are garbage," Baker announced, pacing behind the prone students. "Welcome to the real world. You think the enemy waits for overcast skies and zero wind? Figure it out. Read the mirage." "Trust your dope." Caleb was sweating. Real sweat this time, smelling sharp and coppery with cortisol. He lay behind his rifle, his Kestrel meter plugged into his ballistic app, his phone screen glaring in the harsh sun. "Wind is varying," Caleb muttered to his spotter, a nervous kid named Hayes. 5 to 12 miles an hour. "It's fishtailing." "I can't even see the plate through the mirage," Hayes whispered, his eye glued to the spotting scope. "It keeps bouncing." Caleb gritted his teeth. "Just watch my trace. Give me a call." He settled in. The crosshairs drifted over the blurred white shape in the distance. He tried to time the wind, waiting for a lull. The grass at 300 yards was blowing left. The dust at 800 yards was blowing right. It was a nightmare. He held breath, squeezed, crack. "Miss," Hayes called immediately. "High right, maybe 2 feet off the plate." Caleb cursed under his breath, cycling the bolt so hard he scraped his knuckles against the optic mount. A drop of blood welled up, bright and red against his pale skin. He ignored it. "Give me a correction," Caleb demanded. Hold left edge. Drop a half MOA," Hayes guessed. Caleb adjusted. Fired again. Miss. Low. In the dirt. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Caleb's chest. He wasn't just missing. He was lost. He didn't know where the bullets were going. The math was breaking down. The wind was a living thing, slapping his rounds out of the air. He fired a third time. Miss. A fourth. Miss. His shoulder ached. His vision blurred. A stress-induced tunnel vision, closing in around the edges of his scope. "Cease fire," Baker called out, his tone dripping with disappointment. "Clear your weapons. Nobody's hitting anything today. We're done. Clean up and get back to the barracks." The students grumbled, exhausted and defeated, packing up their gear. Caleb didn't move. He lay there, his cheek resting on the hot stock of the rifle, staring through the optic at the mocking white plate a mile away. He felt a sickening twist in his gut. He was supposed to be the best. He was supposed to be flawless. 10 minutes later, the line was empty, except for Caleb. He sat cross-legged in the dirt, frantically crunching numbers on his phone, trying to backsolve why his dope data on previous engagements was completely wrong. A heavy, rhythmic thud broke his concentration. Edmund was walking down the line, carrying a stack of splintered wooden target stakes over his shoulder. He dropped them into a pile near the trash cans with a loud clatter, dusting off his thick leather gloves. He paused, looking out down the range. "You're overthinking it," a raspy voice floated over. Caleb snapped his head up. Edmund was standing a few feet away, leaning heavily on a rusted metal trash barrel. "Excuse me?" Caleb spat, his frustration boiling over. "Do you mind? I'm trying to figure out a ballistic anomaly." Edmund chuckled. It was a dry, scraping sound, like sandpaper on wood. Ballistic anomaly. That's a fancy way of saying you missed. Caleb stood up, his face flushing dark red. The thermals are pushing a cross-canyon draft that isn't registering on the Kestrel. The mirage is throwing off the optical center of the target by at least a minute of angle. It's mathematically impossible to put a first-round hit on that plate right now. Edmund looked at Caleb, really looked at him. The old man's pale eyes drifted down to Caleb's bleeding knuckle, then to the glowing screen of the phone clutched in his hand. "You look at the screen too much," Edmund said mildly. "You look at the numbers. You ain't looking at the dirt." "I know how to read wind, old man," Caleb growled, grabbing his rifle by the carrying handle. "I'm top of the class. This is an equipment limitation." Edmund slowly reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a battered tin of mints. He popped one into his mouth, his jaw working slowly. He didn't seem angry. He just seemed incredibly tired of the conversation. Then, Edmund did something strange. He walked over to the bone pile, a wooden rack at the back of the firing line, where the instructors tossed broken, obsolete, or loaner weapons that were waiting for armorers to fix them. Edmund reached into the pile and pulled out a rifle. It was a relic, an old Remington 700 action bolted into a fiberglass Macmillan stock that had been painted and repainted so many times it looked like a bruised piece of fruit. The barrel was thick, heavy, and missing half its bluing, revealing dull gray steel underneath. Sitting on top of it was a fixed 1-0 power Unertal style scope, its brass objective bell dented, the tube scratched to hell. It was the kind of gun a museum would reject for being too ugly. Edmund checked the chamber with a practiced, fluid motion that completely belied his stiff, limping walk. The bolt glided back with a buttery slickness that made Caleb blink. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked, his tone dropping from angry to confused. Edmund didn't answer. He walked past Caleb, limping over to the concrete pad. He didn't lay out a shooting mat. He didn't use a rear sandbag. He just dropped to the ground, his bad knee hitting the concrete with a dull thud that made Caleb wince. Edmund rested the heavy barrel on a beat-up canvas rucksack someone had left behind. "Hey, you can't be on the gun line," Caleb said, looking around nervously. Suddenly terrified Baker would come back and blame him for letting the janitor play with firearms. Edmund ignored him. He reached into his deep pocket and pulled out a single, loose brass cartridge. It wasn't the sleek, high-tech 338 Lapua Caleb used. It was an old, fat 308 Winchester. He thumbed it into the chamber and closed the bolt. Caleb watched, entirely against his will. The old man's posture was atrocious. He wasn't square to the rifle. His breathing wasn't deep or measured. But as Edmund settled his cheek behind the rusty, dented scope, a subtle shift occurred. The trembling in his hands stopped. the ragged, uneven rise and fall of his chest smoothed out. For a split second, the old man and the beaten-up rifle looked like they were carved out of a single piece of weathered stone. "You can't shoot 308 at 1,200 yards in this wind," Caleb said, his voice quiet now, driven by sheer technical disbelief. "It goes subsonic at 900. The bullet will tumble. It's physics." Edmund didn't look up from the scope. He kept both eyes open. He didn't look at the grass. He didn't look at the mirage. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to the rustle of the dry sagebrush behind them. "Physics," Edmund rasped softly, his finger slipping inside the trigger guard. "Ain't nothing but a suggestion when the wind owes you a favor." Edmund didn't hold his breath. He didn't pause. He just breathed out a long, slow sigh, and the rifle cracked. The sound of the shot was wrong. Caleb was used to the sharp, whip-crack concussion of modern Magnum cartridges, a violent tearing of the air that assaulted the eardrums. Edmund's rifle didn't crack. It boomed. It was a deep, guttural bellow, heavy with the smell of slower-burning, outdated powder. The recoil didn't snap. It pushed, rolling through Edmund's shoulder and transferring into the concrete with a dull vibration Caleb felt in his own boots. Then came the weight. A 308 Winchester round, fired at a target 1,200 yards away, is a dying thing. By the time it passes the 900-yard mark, it is bleeding velocity, bleeding spin, fighting just to stay in the air. Caleb's brain, wired for instant gratification and high-speed data, rebelled against the silence. 1001, 1002. It felt like an eternity. He was already opening his mouth to speak, to declare the shot a guaranteed miss, a physical impossibility, a waste of smack. It wasn't the crisp, musical ping of a high-velocity impact. It was a flat, exhausted thud. The sound of heavy lead, violently meeting hardened steel, delayed by distance and distorted by the heavy air. Caleb lunged toward the spotting scope Hayes had abandoned. He jammed his eye into the rubber cup, his breath fogging the edge of the ocular lens. Through the boiling, watery distortion of the mirage, the white steel silhouette danced. But there, on the lower left quadrant of the plate, a fat, gray smear of vaporized lead. "Luck," Caleb whispered. His voice was thin, completely lacking the booming resonance of his ego. He sounded like a frightened child. He pulled his head away from the scope and looked at Edmund. The old man was slowly cycling the bolt. He didn't rip it back with the aggressive, tactical flair the instructors taught. He pulled it smoothly, delicately. The spent brass casing arced lazily out of the ejection port. Edmund didn't let it hit the concrete. His thick, calloused hand snapped out, catching the brass midair with the casual, unconscious reflex of a man swatting a fly. He dropped the hot casing into his breast pocket. He hadn't even looked downrange to confirm the hit. "Do it again," Caleb demanded. His hands were shaking. A weird hot knot of anger and humiliation was tightening in his throat. "There's a 6-foot drop at that distance with that cartridge. The wind drift is at least 12 feet. Do it again." Edmund looked down at the rusty bolt of the Remington. He ran a thumb over the dented scope tube. "Ammo's. Expensive. Kid." Caleb frantically dug into his tactical pants, pulling out his wallet. His fingers fumbled, tearing a crisp $20 bill from the fold. He thrust it out, his arm rigid. Edmund looked at the money. A slow, tired sigh rattled in his chest. He didn't take the bill. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out another fat brass cartridge. This time, Caleb didn't look through the spotting scope. He watched Edmund. He watched the man, trying to steal the algorithm. Edmund chambered the round. He didn't square his shoulders. He didn't adjust his parallax. He kept both eyes open. Caleb watched Edmund's face. The pale blue eyes weren't looking through the center of the optic. They were scanning the peripheral edges. "Watch the dirt," Edmund rasped, his voice barely carrying over the howling wind. Edmund wasn't looking at the target. He was looking at a patch of dead cheatgrass, 800 yards out. Then he shifted his gaze to the canyon wall on the right. He waited. He wasn't timing his heartbeat. He was waiting for the earth to do something. A sudden sharp gust of wind slapped Caleb's face, making his eyes water. It was a harsh right-to-left crosswind. "Now," Caleb's brain screamed, "hold right and fire." Edmund didn't fire. He held perfectly still. 5 seconds passed. The gust died down. The heat radiating off the concrete pad felt oppressive. Then Caleb felt a strange sensation. A distinct, unnatural pocket of cold air brushed against his right cheek. It was a backdraft, a thermal anomaly rolling down the shaded side of the canyon, pushing invisibly against the prevailing wind. Edmund exhaled. The heavy barrel didn't flinch. Boom! The deep echo rolled across the valley, bouncing off the rocks. 1001, 1002. Smack! Another flat, exhausted thud. Caleb felt his stomach drop. It was a physical sickness, his entire foundation. The thousands of hours crunching ballistic coefficients, the expensive gear, the arrogant certainty that precision was just a math problem waiting to be solved, crumbled into the dust at his feet. Edmund slowly pushed himself up. His bad knee cracked like a dry branch snapping. He slung the ugly, beat-up rifle over his shoulder. "The math ain't wrong, kid," Edmund said, bending down to grab his push broom. "But math is just a map. It ain't the territory. You're trying to solve a chaotic system with a machine that only understands straight lines." Caleb swallowed hard. "How did you know the hold?" "The cheatgrass," Edmund said, not looking back as he started pushing the broom again. "When it lays flat, it's blowing 10 miles an hour. When the wind hits it hard enough to turn the leaves and show the silver undersides, it's blowing 12. But your machine only measures where you are." Edmund stopped sweeping for a fraction of a second, pointing a gloved finger toward the canyon wall. "That canyon holds cold air in the shade. When the thermals push up the center, the cold air drops down the sides to fill the vacuum. You feel that chill on your cheek? That's the backdraft. It acts like a wall. It cancels out your crosswind for the last 300 yards of the bullet's flight. Your fancy Kestrel can't feel the cold from a mile away." Edmund leaned heavily on the broom handle, looking at Caleb's pristine $10,000 rifle sitting in the dirt. "You look at the glass," Edmund said softly. "You need to learn to look at the world." Scrape, scrape, scrape. The arrhythmic sound of the broom faded down the line, leaving Caleb standing completely alone in the wind. By nightfall, the high desert temperature plummeted, stripping the heat from the rocks and leaving a vicious, biting cold in its place. The sky was violently clear, the stars looking like sharp chips of ice scattered across black velvet. Caleb sat on the edge of his metal bunk in the barracks. The LED screen of his ballistic app glowed in the dark room, illuminating his pale face. He stared at the windage formulas, the barometric pressure algorithms, the spin drift calculations. They looked like a foreign language now. They looked like lies. He deleted the profile. He couldn't sleep. The smell of copper and burnt carbon was stuck in his sinuses. He threw on a thick fleece jacket, the synthetic material loud and scratchy in the quiet room, and walked out into the biting cold. He didn't know where he was going until he saw the dull yellow glow of the fluorescent lights spilling from the cracked door of the maintenance shed behind the motor pool. Caleb walked over, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. He paused at the door. The shed smelled intensely of Hoppe's No. 9 solvent, old motor oil. and the sharp, metallic, ozone tang of a bench grinder. Inside, Edmund was sitting on a wobbly metal stool, hunched over a workbench, cluttered with spark plugs, sheared bolts, and greasy rags. The beat-up Remington 700 was broken down on the bench. Edmund was using a brass dental pick to meticulously scrape a microscopic layer of carbon from the extractor claw. Under the harsh, flickering fluorescent light, Caleb saw Edmund's forearms. The sleeves of his thermal shirt were pushed up. Snaking up the old man's left arm, disappearing under the fabric, was a chaotic network of thick, white scars. They weren't surgical. They were ragged and jagged, the unmistakable signature of hot shrapnel, tearing through muscle. Caleb stood in the doorway, feeling incredibly young, incredibly stupid, and wearing gear that suddenly felt like a costume. Edmund didn't look up from his work. "Draft's coming in, kid. Close the door or grab a broom." Caleb stepped inside, letting the heavy metal door click shut behind him. He stood awkwardly by a stack of bald truck tires. "The instructors don't know, do they?" Caleb asked. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual abrasive edge. Edmund wiped the bolt with an oily rag, his movements slow and deliberate. "Know what? That I can shoot? Baker knows. Baker was a fresh-faced boot when I was finishing up my last tour. He lets me sweep the brass, gives me a reason to get out of bed." Caleb looked at the rusted barrel of the rifle. Why let me act like such a jackass all week? The admission tasted like ash in his mouth. It burned to say it. Edmund stopped wiping the bolt. He set it down gently on a clean patch of cloth. He finally looked up. His pale blue eyes caught the harsh overhead light, looking flat and terrifyingly empty. "Because you needed to miss," Edmund said, his gravelly voice dropping to a near whisper. "You shoot like you're playing a video game, like there's a reset button. You hit the target because the math says you're supposed to. You feel entitled to the hit." Edmund picked up the heavy barrel and looked down the bore. "But out there, the math betrays you. The wind shifts, the humidity drops, the earth moves. Edmund, if you don't know how to feel the lie, you miss." Edmund set the barrel down and leaned forward, resting his calloused hands on his knees. "Where I learned to shoot, kid, there were no steel plates. There were no instructors calling your misses. If you missed, the math didn't care. But the guy next to you, he paid for your bad math. He didn't get to go home." The silence in the shed was suffocating. Caleb felt a hollow, sickening weight settle in his gut. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was the sudden, crushing realization of the gravity of what he was actually training to do. He had been treating a tool of extreme violence like a geometry puzzle. "Your gun is a laser beam," Edmund said, leaning back and reaching for his tin of mints. "It's a beautiful piece of machinery, but you're using it as a crutch. You don't know the dirt. You don't know what it smells like when the barometric pressure plummets right before a monsoon. You don't know what a bullet sounds like when it loses stabilization and keyholes into a mud brick wall." Edmund popped a mint into his mouth, his jaw working slowly. He picked up his rag again, dismissing Caleb entirely. "Go to sleep. Tomorrow, leave the weather station in your bag. Shoot with your eyes." The next morning, the firing line smelled exactly the same. Burnt carbon, hot copper, chemical tang. The wind was already howling, kicking up grit that stung Caleb's cheeks. The mirage at 1,200 yards was a boiling sea of distortion. Caleb lay down on his mat. He didn't pull out his Kestrel. He didn't open the app on his phone. He loaded a magazine into his AXSR and settled behind the glass. "Wind is full value, 10 to 15, gusting to 20, Hayes muttered beside him, nervously tapping his own wind meter. "It's a mess out there, man. What's your hold?" Caleb didn't answer. He closed his eyes. He felt the cold, hard concrete pressing against his chest. He took a deep breath through his nose, smelling the dry sagebrush and the dusty alkaline dirt. He felt the wind pushing against the sweat on the back of his neck. It wasn't a number anymore. It was a physical force, a living current wrapping around him. He opened his eyes. He didn't stare at the white steel plate. He looked at the expanse of desert between him and the target. He watched the cheatgrass whipping frantically at 600 yards. He looked for the subtle color shifts in the dirt as the gusts picked up dust. He felt for the cold backdraft on his right cheek. He didn't feel like an apex predator. He didn't feel untouchable. He felt small, imperfect, and entirely at the mercy of the environment. He was just a piece of the desert. The cheatgrass flattened. The cold air brushed his cheek. Caleb pressed his finger against the trigger and squeezed.